All right. What's going on, Dylan? How you doing? Looks like I got at least one person in the stream. I don't think YouTube actually gives you live up to date play by play of who's in the YouTube audience. What's going on, Dylan? How you feeling? I hope all is well. I'll give folks a few more minutes just to kind of flood on in the chat. Mhm. Yes, sir. If y'all are in the chat, if y'all are out there in the YouTube room, drop a like, drop a thumbs up, drop a heart emoji, drop a very animatedly buff arm or whatever passes for it on the emojis. Drop anything in the chat. Let me know that you're here. Dylan has the crown. He's got the number one crown first. All right, Emma, what's happening? All right, yeah, pumpkin face, pumpkin head. There we go. Got a like out of it too. That's what's up. Happy Halloween, folks. It is almost time for All Hallows Eve. Almost time for All Hallows Eve. I hope that you all have been maintaining a steady and healthy regimen of scary movies, both short and long or feature length films. I certainly have. I have been every single night subjecting my wife to what arguably might be considered, perhaps by some, certainly by her, possibly, is torture. Um, by watching Freddy, Chucky, Jason, Michael, you name it. We even saw a short movie on YouTube, a short film. It was really good. It was 12 minutes long, but it was really, really good. I am maintaining the healthiest of scary movie digestion over these Octobers and All Hallows Eve. It is October 30th. Welcome and thank y'all so much for tapping on in. Really appreciate you all. I've got a new sweater. Check me out. Hey now, yes, I've got my alma mater, UC Riverside. Highlanders are in the building. Very cool sweatshirt. I certainly love it. Leslie, what's happening? Great to see you with a golden heart too. I love it. Absolutely. That is a golden heart for my immunity and for vitality. It's almost as good as a one-up mushroom from Mario. I hope that you all have been taking care of yourselves too, as well, during this kind of temperature shift and change. Any of you suffering from allergies have probably been feeling the effects of the weather shifts, from hot to cold, from dry to humid. It's not that great for folks like myself. I am certainly allergy prone. In any event, I do indeed want to welcome you all to another office hours with CAG. I am your friendly neighborhood professor, swinging through the hallways, highways, and byways of a local YouTube room near you. Aha. It has taken me about 4 or 5 episodes to get that right. I have finally landed the plane. Joy. Yay. I wish I had sound effects on here. Hmm. I'm gonna have to get some sort of type of outside platform or resources. One of your classmates was able to help me to navigate my way through um, how to do the how to pull in audience members, people from the chat into the YouTube live. I have not yet gotten the apps, but we know for sure that YouTube does not allow that. They do not have those capabilities. If anybody does indeed know something about YouTube that I do not, please help your boy. Help your boy. And thank y'all so much. I will actually try to keep tonight very tight because it's at the point in the semester where a lot of you have a lot of things going on, midterms and things of that sort. And also too, the Dodgers are playing tonight, if I'm not mistaken. I think tonight there's first game in Toronto, um if it's not already over. I don't know, I haven't even taken a look at the TV this entire day. So keep me updated. But I will also too keep it nice and tight, so that way we can really kind of dial in and focus on our book, Jennifer Government. I want to introduce the book to you in a way that allows you to kind of get the full picture of the setting that we're about to enter into. Okay. Now, Jennifer Government is a book that comes off of the heels of at least 2 to 3 documentaries that we've already viewed collectively, both in my in-person class and also in my online classes. So at this point in the semester, now that you all have 2 essays underneath your belt, you all have, at the very least, the writing assignment number 1, which is the critical memoir, which helped us to understand how to establish connections with our audiences, how to establish an emotional connection with our audience. And then also writing assignment number 2, which is the rhetorical analysis, which equipped us with the skills that we need in order to um, examine the text or a message that an author composes and delivers to an audience in at least 2 ways: contextually and textually, right? As you all will recall from the PowerPoint lecture, How to Write a Rhetorical Analysis, the contextual analysis is just as important as the textual analysis, right? Whereas contextual analysis focuses on the examination of a text and the environment in which the text was shaped, right? So specifically looking at cream in a hip hop sense, excuse me, cream in a rhetorical sense, right? Looking at the rhetorical situation. Remember, the components of a rhetorical situation can easily be remembered with the acronym CREAM: context, rhetor, exigence, audience, message. Cream in a rhetorical sense, right? Or cream through a rhetorical lens, right? Um, as we begin to analyze texts and we execute a rhetorical analysis, we want to consider and examine the components. We want to actually break down and discuss the various components of a text's rhetorical situation. You want to analyze Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed? Great, cool. Do some research and learn more about the context, learn more about the rhetor or the speaker. What was the exigence that sparked the book to be written in the first place? Who was the audience that she was examining, or excuse me, that she sought to deliver her message to, or audiences, right? And lastly, right, what is the message that she's composed, right? Considering, describing, and discussing those 5 texts, analyzing a text with those 5 components, um, is how we conduct a contextual analysis, right? or at least it provides us with the framework for conducting a contextual analysis. Textual analysis, on the other hand, focuses more clearly and cleanly on examining the means by which a writer or an author um, delivered their message persuasively, right? And the ways that we examine how a writer delivers their message persuasively is, of course, through the use of the Aristotelian appeals, right? From way back in the day, right? According to the taxonomist Aristotle, right? Ancient Greek philosopher, dude was about 3,000 years, dude who lived about 3,000 years ago, right? So now that we have those two essays there underneath our belt, we've been equipped with, at the very least, a way in which we can establish an emotional connection with our audience through the use of narratives, and we can also examine the messages and the means by which other writers seek to persuade their audiences. Right? We can examine the messages of other people. Right? So, what I want for us to actually focus on here in today's in the Class with CAG episode, or excuse me, in today's in the Class with CAG session is, hey, man, I'm sitting up here talking about an episode like we're really on television. Um, Jennifer Government's Max Berry's Jennifer Government. Okay. Uh, and how I want to actually start out is by highlighting a couple of things that we discussed in, excuse me, that were shared with you all in week 7 of our Canvas module. So let me share my screen with y'all. Okay, so first and foremost, it's vitally important that we begin to have this conversation about Jennifer Government, Max Berry's Jennifer Government, and what's going on in the book itself, in certain framed ways, right? The framed ways, or what I mean by framed ways, meaning that we have to actually have this conversation, right, within a kind of conceptual framework, right? The frameworks themselves help us to actually see more clearly, right, as opposed to us just having a conversation that's not couched by a framework, and that's just open for free interpretation and conversation, right? Now, mind you, there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually really cool. Especially if we're in the barbershop or the beauty shop, right? You get to have free and open conversation about pretty much any topic that you'd like. However, within the context of academic reading and writing, we want to make sure that we couch our conversation, our discussion, our analysis, our lecture, right? Everything that's going on about this book within a framework. Now, what do I mean by framework? Well, you see these things I got right on over my eye holes. They're called glasses, right? There's a big, like kind of studio box that's like right in my way. These glasses are special to me. Ever since I was a child, wanted these glasses right here, these particular pair. Why? Because these used to be my dad's glasses. And he told me, I asked him, I said, Dad, I want to get some glasses like yours. Um, and he certainly got me the Danny Glover Lethal Weapon ones. Anybody who knows what those are, they're like the aviator, but they're cut off. They're like aviator lens, but they're cut off right down at the bottom, so it's flat. You got like a little bridge right across the way. It's very dorky, very nerdy as a child. So when it comes to this nerd thing, I've been doing it for quite some time. Um, but to get back to the subject, these lenses, or rather these frames, which hold the lenses in, right, do a specific kind of job. The frames themselves do just that, right? They actually help to hold the lens in place, which can rest over the bridge of my nose, right, and sit just in front of my eyes, which allows me to actually see a little bit better for things that are close up, right? Some of you may actually wear glasses that helps you to actually see things better from far away. Some of y'all wear glasses that help you to see things kind of better in the mid range. Some of you wear glasses that help you see both mid and long range. Some of you wear glasses that just quite simply help you to see better for things that are a lot closer to you or while you're on the computer screen, right? In any event, and whatever the case may actually be for your eyes, um, they the idea behind having an academic conversation about a literary text can be best understood by, see, I'm sorry, I have phones going off here. Okay. Sorry. Um, the idea of having an academic conversation about literature can be best understood using the metaphor or the analogy of frames, right? So, in literature, or excuse me, in academia, when we have conversations about literature, we always want to make sure that we have it couched within a particular kind of conceptual framework. That is to say, we want to have the conversation in ways that allow us to see more clearly the movements that, or excuse me, um, what kind of changes and transformations the character, the protagonist, is experiencing. Also, what kind of journey that character is going on, right? And how that character gets confronted, bombarded, in some cases, right, wrestles or struggles with or against both internal and external factors, right? Um, some of those internal or external factors, excuse me, all of those internal and external factors, whichever one they may actually be, either internal or external, are designed to help that protagonist become what they're truly meant to be, right? Or to make a transformation, which is part of the reason why protagonists are more or less kind of designed and developed as round characters. But where am I coming from with all this language here, right? Round characters, right? Protagonist, antagonist, right? The development of a character. Where's that coming from? Well, it's coming from the framework that I'm using to draw on, excuse me, that I'm drawing on to talk about literature, right? You see, our conceptual frameworks function just like or very similar to the frames in a glasses in a pair of glasses. See, the frames actually hold the lens up that allow us to see the text a little bit better and what's happening in the text along the protagonist's journey. So, as a way to start to introduce us to a set of frames or lenses through which we can begin to understand better and see better the journey that Jennifer Government is going on throughout this particular novel, I want to introduce to you all a set of theoretical, or what we would call in literature, thematic frameworks. All right. This is coming directly from week 7 underneath um, the post about themes for Jennifer Government. I think it's like the second or third post that's underneath week 7. And so what you'll see here is a list of themes and what are called motifs. Now, I'll explain what motifs are in just a second. But themes, if you recall back from our unit number 1, where we focused on the elements of narrative structure. A theme is defined as a universal, a fundamental or universal ideal, right? That's fundamentally explored in a work, right? And so these are fundamental ideas that are explored in a particular text, the text that we're reading, Jennifer Government. One of those themes, management by surveillance, the dominant corporation, right? Wage slavery. Now, where might we heard those themes before? Well, for all of you who might be thinking, okay, well, that sounds similar to, isn't that what we were talking about with, um, Oh, what's the lady's name? Isn't that what we were talking about with Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed? If you thought that, you would certainly be correct. That's exactly what we were discussing, or at least those are some of the major themes that we saw being explored in Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed, right? Remember how Barbara Ehrenreich recounted countless instances where she and the management would clash, right? Or rather, where when workers and management would clash. Oftentimes, right, they found themselves lamenting how micromanaged they actually were because of the theme otherwise known as, right, management by surveillance. This here is an example, right? Those clashes are examples of what happens as a result of management by surveillance, right? We got to see, at least in the footnotes, right, at least a couple of examples that speak to the issue or the larger idea of the dominant corporation, right, where the corporation can be largely thought about as an entity in which individuals work together to provide goods and services to a public, right? Um, that's at the bare bones level. That's what a corporation is. The thing that distinguishes your average everyday LLC from, say, for example, a dominant corporation, right, is one, the network of not only distribution, but also to the network of production, right? How far or expansive, how vast that network might actually be. For a dominant corporation, that network spans across the globe. It is beyond just one nation, right? It might actually be rooted in multiple nations, two, three, four. It might even be a global corporation, right? These are what we call transnational corporations, or in other words, um, a dominant institution, right, that influences the distribution of wealth, right? They do so much volume that they're too big to fail. They do so much business that they can influence the distribution of wealth, right? And accrue it at the top, right? While reallocating access to wealth for those folks who might not be at the top of the socioeconomic totem pole. Okay. Right. So in this case, it could be defined, a dominant corporation could be defined as a dominant institution that influences the distribution of wealth for profit and externalizes, meaning that they put off the costs that are associated with making and selling a particular product. Right. That's one of the defining characteristics of a dominant corporation. And largely, those corporations that Barbara Ehrenreich worked with, she worked with several different kinds of organizations, but for the most part, when she was working, for example, at Walmart, that was an example of a dominant corporation, right? We remember some of the issues that ended up actually kind of popping up while she was working at Walmart. Today, what I want to actually focus on is the main theme that lies at the heart of Jennifer Government's Nickel and excuse me, at Jennifer that lies at the heart of Jennifer Government. Um, the main theme that lies at the heart of Jennifer Government is, hey, I'm sorry, y'all. I am totally looking at my dog, and she is about to have an accident right now. I will be right back. Excuse me. We're going to take a quick pause for the cause. Oh, please don't have an accident, doggy. Dang it. Where's this one? All right, I am back, folks. So sorry about that. Okay, so um an accident was avoided. Disaster was certainly avoided. Um okay, so where did I leave off? All right, so Cream, I want to talk about the main theme that lies at the heart of Max Berry's Jennifer Government in this novel. Okay, so the main theme or fundamental message that Max Berry seeks to explore uh, in this novel, Max Berry is interested in exploring and unpacking just really what would happen if corporations were king in a world, a dystopian world set in the not too far flung future. To some degree or another, we're actually there now relative to where he started, relative to where he first began writing this book, which was in the early 2000s. I think it actually was in 2000 was when it was first published. Um, but Max Berry explores a world where corporations are king, public services are no longer provided. They've actually, all public services, all forms of the public good have been replaced effectively by privatization, right? Privatization. Okay. Um, Max Berry explores a world in which essentially cash or an individual's ability to accrue profit determines whether or not they are, at least in a civic sense, right? Meaning like legally, juridically, socially, economically, alive, right? Versus those folks who do not have the ability to accrue capital, who are seen civically as what the great theorist who goes by the name of Orlando, I believe his name is Orlando Patterson, calls right socially or civically dead. Right. Max Berry's Jennifer Government takes us into a world where, in essence, cash rules everything around me. Cream in a hip hop sense. And the reason why I actually say cream in a hip hop sense is because hip hop actually has figured out the fundamental underpinnings, the functions, and also too the major features of this very complicated, very multi-layered, very at times even right confusing. It was very confusing when I was trying to learn how to describe or when I was first learning about it. Um, it's confusing concept, otherwise known as neoliberalism, right? Now, neoliberalism refers to a mode of governance that's based on free market, that's based on the ideals and values and beliefs of the free market, right? Even the practices of the free market, right? Um, which are to say, right? Values such as competitiveness, self interestedness, privatization, ownership, right? And deregulation, right? You see, within this conceptual framework, right, or within this world, this world of cream, right, celebrities, top entertainers, politicians, corporate tech giants, right, heck, even the news media, right, particular particularly journalists, right, and even intellectuals to that degree, right, seek to legitimize and represent idealized images, right? They keep in place these idyllic images, right? Images that actually help to create and reinforce the dream, right? Or a dream-like idealicism. In other words, the American dream, for example, right? Within this ecosystem, right? This world, this novel, Max Berry explores what life is like when not only the United States, there's not even a such thing as the United States anymore. There's the U.S. territories in this book, um, but you have this idea where what if we got rid of all public resources and reallocated all those public resources into the hands of private owners, right? So whether we're talking about firefighters, right, who put out fires or who even kind of rescue folks, especially who need emergency medical attention, right? We're talking about police officers, right? We're talking about librarians or libraries. We're talking about beaches, anything, buses, trains, planes, automobiles, right? Well, the planes and automobiles are a little bit more private or a lot more private, but at least for the buses, right? And the trains themselves. Wow. Could you imagine what it would be like to actually live in a world where everything costs money and there is no such thing as a public good or service? Now, for some of you, you might be saying, "Well, yeah, Cac, I can kind of sort of imagine it right now. I just had to pay $15 to take 3 buses to get home, right?" And I'm not trying to be funny as I'm describing this world. I'm not trying to dismiss the experiences that we go through on a daily basis here, but rather I simply mean to highlight for you all. Max Berry wrote this novel in 2000. For me, it doesn't seem like that was that long ago, but some of you might not have even been born then. You, many of my students in my face-to-face class were born right around the cusp of the Great Recession, 2008. It's interesting because that was also to the moment in which publicly, right, within the public lexicon, within on a wide scale social level, within the national consciousness, we begin to see a shift in the national consciousness, the ways in which we begin to think about ourselves as a country, the way that we begin to talk about ourselves as individuals, as a nation of individuals. Right? We begin to also see being introduced this conversation, this notion of self branding or thinking about yourself as a brand. And so some of you were born in that era in which you were already on the track, already on the path to having all public goods and services privatized, right? Like there's not a world that you could recall or remember in which there was a such thing as a public good, right? That did not cost. Okay. So for some of you, you might actually be thinking that that highlights an analogy, right? Or rather a parallel between the world that we live in and the world that Max Berry has actually constructed with this book entitled Jennifer Government. Right. And so I want to kind of unpack this notion of cream and just kind of explore it a bit more and dive into what its meaning, what it means, and also how it functions. But I want to actually use hip hop as a way to kind of build a bridge between where you are, what you might actually be somewhat more familiar with when it comes to neoliberalism, and where Max Berry's Jennifer Government kind of situates us. So I want to actually switch gears here. Let me view. I'm going to stop sharing for a quick second and then reshare a new window of mine. Now let's. So this particular lecture here is what I call cream of the hip hop, neoliberalism and rap's consciousness. Okay. Let me actually put this in presentation mode. If I can. Slide. All right. Okay, cool. So, oftentimes, what I actually start off these lectures with is just a careful kind of round robin around the room if I'm doing it live. But since I'm doing this online, I'll just kind of walk and direct us through this a lot quicker. So, some of the first things that we actually notice here is first and foremost, this here is a what they call a two-page spread, right? A two-page ad spread. And what is happening here in this ad is in the lower left-hand corner, we can see where exactly this ad is kind of situated. And it's situated in Shimokitazawa, Tokyo, right? Which is like a major, one of the major urban districts or enclaves, right? Where hip hop culture is kind of cultivated, practiced, and where it kind of circulates, right? In Japan. And in there, in that district, you have a barber shop, right? I'm not exactly sure which barber shop this is, but within this barber shop here, we have about five individuals, um, all of whom are kind of dressed in the style and aesthetic of what some might actually perceive or consider to be right hip hop cultural aesthetics, right? And we can kind of see to at least some degree, right, where folks might come from with that read. But in just a second, I'm going to actually kind of challenge that read, or rather, the logic of the ad itself is going to challenge that read, right? Because here, right, we see the young lady who's sitting down taking pictures of someone. She's not quite taking pictures of this guy right here. Heck, her camera is actually the camera line is going somewhere over here. So possibly maybe something over this way. Not quite sure, but she's certainly not taking a picture of this guy getting his hair braided. But here we see her right with her stylish fedora, right? She has a bit of an afro here coming out of the creeping out of the undersides of the fedora. She's draped in green and gold, right? Which is a very popular at the time that this ad here came out in 2008, was a popular kind of color combination, and it was also too very symbolic right alongside of the hat, with an archetypal figure within hip hop culture, specifically rap music culture, industrial rap music culture, known as the pimp. Right, so she's looking very pimpish with her style here, right? And then we see the gentleman next to her, right, in baggy sweatpants, what looks to be like Air Force Ones. Let's pray to God that they're not Air Force Ones, because he's certainly creasing the tip of his Air Force Ones just by how he's holding his foot right here. That is a big no-no for Air Force Ones, for Air Force One lovers. They do not try to crease that. If you get a crease in that thing, oh my gosh, it's all over. You got to throw them away and buy a new pair. Here we see, right, he's decorated in shades and also two minor, but yet still significant jewelry, right? The gentleman right next to him has a backward cap, earrings, jewelry, right? Baggy jeans and also two shirt, right? Jewels, watches on, right? And here we have I'm not sure if I can call him a barber because he's braiding. So he might actually be the barbershop's braider, right? With a tapered haircut, right? And also to a connect up, a throwback jersey at the time that was very popular, football jersey, right? With dreads locked up in a ponytail, and also two, sorry, excuse me, not dreads, but locks rather. And sitting down in the chair, we see a gentleman with his hair half braided and half in an afro, along with another connect up. Still, also two draped in the jewelry, right? Rings and also bracelets, baggy clothes, and a baggy shirt underneath him. Um, don't forget about this medical marijuana. I don't even know if it's medicinal. However, it does have the cross symbol, so we'll say that it is indeed medicinal. But we do know that out here in California, really across the United States, when you see a green cross, that is indeed symbolic for medical marijuana. I'm not sure what the color what the color code or scheme might be, or how it may change in Japan. But this, at least within an American cultural context, if we're using that lens and we're applying it to this ad, right, is certainly symbolic of weed, Okay. Here's the problem though with this entire ad, right? There are two problems. One, this here is an ad which on the surface might quite simply look like it's an ad that's affirming hip hop culture, right? Showing how expansive hip hop culture actually is. The problem comes into play when you finish reading the ad and you go down to the text and it doesn't say anything about hip hop at all, but it does say the Black experience is everywhere. For those of you who cannot see, this might actually be too small on my share. The ad's text says the Black experience is everywhere, meaning that all of those signifiers that I just quite simply mentioned and highlighted here, everything from the green and gold, the baggy sweatsuits, the jewelry, right? The fade, the haircuts or the styles, right? The kind of fedora hat, right? With the afro, backwards turned cap, the jewels, right? So on and so forth, even the marijuana box over in the corner. All of these are kind of signs or symbols, what we call in literature a metonym, right? Where a part that is typically associated with the larger whole, but is not necessarily physically a part of that larger whole, right? But a part that is usually associated with that larger whole is used to convey blackness, meaning that according to the logic of this ad, and therefore, right, the logic of the global market itself, within the logic of the global market itself, blackness just quite simply gets reduced not to a culture, not to a culture that has a history or traditions or rituals or norms or beliefs or values, right, or major accomplishments, figures, and things of that sort. No, 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 no. According to the logic of this ad, within the logic of the global market itself, global market logic argues that blackness is just quite simply a set of metonymic signifiers that can be bought and sold on the global market, right? Shimokizawa, Tokyo, can be bought and sold on the global market, and people could just quite simply experience it by buying it. That raises one central problem. At what other point in US history, right, have we seen blackness get reduced to pieces that are bought and sold on the global market? Get reduced to objects, I mean, not so much where their humanity is actually erased, where the person, right, their being is actually erased, right, and bought and sold, not as a human, but rather as property to be owned, to be possessed, right? To come under the relegation of privatized ownership, right? What other point in time in US history have we seen blackness be bought and sold on the global market? Again, like, if this was a live class, I would be asking these questions here, right, to my live audience. But in the interest of time, right, if you want to, you can go ahead on and drop it down here, drop your answers here in the chat for sure. I'll see some of them. But in the interest of our time and our session here together, I'm gonna highlight it for you, right? That only other time in human history where blackness was bought and sold on the market, right, to be owned, to be purchased, right, to even be sold, irrespective of whether or not you had friends, irrespective of whether or not you had family, irrespective of whether or not you were a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, a son, a daughter, so on and so forth, right? You just had to quite simply go, or even, right, where they took pieces of Black folks, right? Their ears, right? Their genitalia, right? Their arms, right? Their toes, their noses, their tongues, so on and so forth, right? The only other point in time in human history where we've had blackness being sold on the global market was during the time of enslavement. So, what does that tell us? Well, quite simply, within the logic of the global marketplace, black blackness, right, as a culture, right, blackness as It is connected to or rooted right within a person's being or body, right? Not the phenotype. I'm not even just talking about phenotype here, right? I'm talking about culture, right? I'm talking about the very existential, right? The episteme, the ontological. Blackness has absolutely zero significance outside of its use and exchange value. In other words, right, if I'm saying it just quite simply, within the logic of the global market, blackness has absolutely no association or affiliation to a group, but rather it in and of itself is an object to be bought and sold. And its value only lies insofar as it has the ability to be used or it has the ability to be exchanged for something of a higher value, equal or higher, an equal or higher value, right? Oh, so here's the second problem with this ad, right? So we've discussed the first problem, right? That it reinforces, right, through the logic of global market, um, uh, well, really through the logic of global market capitalism, it reinforces the very logic, right? The very viewpoint, right? The very outlook on blackness, not so much as it's associated with humanity, but rather it views blackness as an object, right? To be bought and sold. That's the first problem that this ad here has. The second problem is some of you might be able to actually see it. I'm not quite sure. Whoops. Um, I might actually be in the way of this thing. Hey, let me see. Can I adjust that? I hope I'm not actually in the way of it. If I am, my apologies. Um, let me see. Can I move that? I can't move it. Hmm. Oh no. Okay. Sorry, y'all. I can't even move where I think I'm showing up on the screen right now. Customizations details. Yeah, I can't even move that. So sorry, y'all. Goodness gracious. Heck, man, dude, if only I could pop out dashboard. Channel level settings. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna have to tell y'all what's right here. Guess what this ad is for, ladies and gentlemen? If you guessed because you have either some very cool technology at your disposal, where you can zoom right on in and see in the upper right hand corner um, that it says where it's from in the upper right hand corner, then you are amazing. But if you are kind of sort of can't really see what the icon is at the bottom, this is a an ad for Nissan for a car. Now, the smart ones on this audience here are gonna say, "Cag, you lying." That's what the smart ones are gonna say. "Cag, you tripping. It can't be for." How's it gonna be for Nissan, Cag? You you need to get your lenses checked. That's what the smart ones are gonna say, right? No, I'm not tripping. I'm not tripping, y'all. This is an ad for Nissan. What you really want to ask is, where's the car? And what the heck does the black experience being everywhere have to do with a Nissan advertisement? Well, see, it makes sense if you actually connect the dots through stereotypes, right? Or understand how it is that this ad was composed, which is through the lens of stereotypes. Stereotypes that actually associate blackness with poorness and Nissans with affordability and therefore, right, being more popular, made more popular among crowds that cannot afford luxury items, and it therefore being a sign or a symbol of blackness as being associated with poverty. You see, this ad right here, well, excuse me, that represents the second problem with this ad. It's an ad about a car, but there's no car that's being sold. Blackness is being sold in this advertisement. Now, the real question that we have to ask is, how the heck did Nissan even get away with this? And how did anything in the advertising world, or how did advertising come to be like this? In order to really understand how an ad like this takes shape and comes about, we have to dive into understanding what hip hop culture is. Hip hop culture is a set of expressive practices that were created in a post industrial US landscape that drew a lot on, that drew heavily, almost exclusively from Black and Latino cultural forms, right? This definition here, I'm particularly drawing from the hip hop scholar by the name of Emery Petchower, right? From his 2009 book. And when we're this is also too just a commonly shared history, especially that you may have actually seen become more popular uh, over the last 2 years since hip hop has celebrated its 50th anniversary of existence, right? Its 50th birthday. So they had like a ton of documentaries. They had a ton of series and things like that where they're interviewing people in New York and they're just asking them, hey, where did hip hop start? Where did it come from? Right. And so part of what you have to understand is that in the narrative of hip hop, right, within the cultural framing of hip hop, the first firmaments of hip hop are based on what they call the four elements, right? The four elements of hip hop, right? Which include graffiti art, right? B-boying or B-girling, DJing, and MCing, right? And when it comes to MCing, a lot of you in my classes and just in general are more familiar with hip hop from the standpoint not of any one of those other elements, right? But rather from the standpoint of MCing, right? MCing has introduced a variety of different kinds of what we call right rap, right, or the primary mode of expression that's typically associated with hip hop culture, which is called rapping, right? Some people actually make the argument that rapping started or evolved from toasting in Jamaica, right? Where you kind of say a toast and you grab the microphone at celebrations or, weddings, especially, right? Or even at funerals, right? Where somebody will grab the microphone and share a benediction, right? Or a good word, right? With the people. Sometimes that in that good word, right, they might make certain things rhyme, or they might actually kind of signify, or they might kind of testify as to how great this person was, or how awful this person may have actually been, right? And to some degree or another, it's not that hip hop or MCing as an element actually evolved directly from toasting from Jamaica, um, but rather that's one of the lifelines that help to keep it alive. Not that it's the point at which hip hop was created, right, or that MCing was created, right? Because you have folks within an African American cultural context who, prior to the 1970s, which is when hip hop is first kind of made legible on the scene, you have people before the 1970s who were actually doing this thing called that they call themselves rapping, like Dolomite, for example, right? Like Pig Meek Markham, right? Um, like Maud Mabley, right? We have a variety of different folks, like the Lost Poets, excuse me, the Last Poets, like the Watts Prophets, right? These are folks who engage in the art of what is known as and defined not by somebody who comes from Jamaica, but rather folks from within the US as rapping, right? So the majority of you might actually be familiar with MCing through rap. However, whether or not you're familiar with these any of these elements, um, or if this is your first time getting introduced to them, um, part of what we have to understand here is that all four of these elements are actually undergirded by the first firmament in hip hop, right? The element that supports and upholds, right? That lifts, right? The very ground upon which these four pillars of hip hop are plunged into and are therefore supported by the first firmament of knowledge, right? That is the hidden, oftentimes overlooked fifth element of hip hop. When it comes to hip hop culture, it helps for us to think about them in three particular kinds of ways, right? You have what Bakari Kitwana calls the hip hop generation, right? You also have what Emery Petchower, right, and many others, right? Murray Foreman, Trisha Rose, right, call or refer to as the hip hop nation, right? You also have what those folks also to refer to as a hip hop head, right? Any part of hip hop culture recognizes and also to in some degree or another refers to themselves when they're talking about hip hop as a culture in one of these particular kind of modes, right? Either as a generation to signify those folks who were born between the era or the time frame of 1964, excuse me, sorry, 1965 to 1984, right? Which is what Bakari Kitwana in his book entitled The Hip Hop Generation, the time period in which he actually marks as the most crucial and important time frame or era for birthing hip hop, right? And for nurturing hip hop, right? And then you also have what's referred to as the hip hop nation, right? What Trisha Rose in her book entitled Culture Wars refers to as the Hip Hop Nation, along with hip hop heads, right? Or even Nelson George, who also talks, who has a book called Hip Hop Nation, right? Or excuse me, sorry, Hip Hop America, where he breaks down the definitions of hip hop nation and the hip hop head, right? And here he's just quite simply referring to an imagined community in which individuals through who participate in those activities, those elements of hip hop, right, begin to form bonds and beliefs and commonly held values, traditions, even, right, where they're able to group themselves together across geographical spaces and also to times by these commonly held practices, values, and beliefs, right? And a hip hop head is an individual who identifies with the hip hop nation, right? Within the hip hop cultural framework, we also have what's known as practice, all right, of the cipher, right? And also emceeing, whereas the cipher could be thought about as the classroom in which individuals can witness and also to develop or learn the skills of emceeing, right? Um, so when it comes to rap, it helps if we understand it based on, or if I explain it, and if we begin to unpack it from the standpoint of how it's distributed, right? So when we're thinking about how hip hop is distributed, it's distributed typically in one of two ways. One, a mainstream way, which is grown, which is um, at least according all the way up as recently as today, right? According to the Billboard Top 100 charts, right? Hip hop is actually falling out of favor, is falling out of the top 40, right? So the mainstream mode of distribution has actually shrunken over the last 20 years. While the underground or independent direct to consumer modes of distribution have completely expanded, right? And they've also formulated new types or styles of corporate ownership, right? And privatization to monetize those new modes of distribution, right? Um, and so this is what we see typically, right, in your Spotify or YouTube, right, or Apple Play Music. Those are those reconceptualized or redeveloped modes of ownership, right? Amazon Music, right? Now, when it comes to hip hop, you see, part of the ways in which individuals develop or achieve right mainstream success is and it still to a large degree is this way, right? If you think about especially artists like Drake, right, versus a Kendrick Lamar, right? Although he's not kind of free from this, right? The idea of how an artist actually becomes recognizable, right? How an artist becomes a household name, i.e., how a rapper becomes successful, has traditionally been an avenue that was reserved for mainstream distribution, right? Mainstream distribution, right, seeks to um, um, mainstream distribution seeks to um, provide mainstream success, right? And so it's interesting because a lot of rappers, right? If we're thinking about someone, for example, like Drake, or even Kendrick Lamar, has established their credibility through their access to mainstream resources and mainstream marketing, right? And so, in a very real kind of way, there's on the one hand within hip hop culture a kind of debate or a divide that suggests that the best way, the primary way, right, the only way, right, to gain recognition is by having the backing of the machine, the corporate machine behind you. So that way you can distribute your name, you can distribute your albums, right? You can get yourself out there as widely as possible, cast as wide of the net as possible, right? And you can become more famous, right? You can become more recognizable, which translates into album sales, right? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are some artists who have not necessarily only put all their eggs into the mainstream basket, right? Artists who retain a certain kind of what Talib Kweli would call um, social responsibility to the community that birthed them, right? Whether that social responsibility be in terms of the politics that their music addresses, whether that social responsibility be found in through actions, right? Through by creating opportunities, by using or leveraging, right, the mainstream visibility, right, to draw awareness to social issues that are important to the home communities that birth these rappers or birth these artists, or even by directly giving back or creating opportunities, programs for upliftment that actually help individuals within those communities that these artists actually come from to make a way and a path, right, towards their own vision of success, right? For those artists who develop, um, for those artists who actually develop that latter approach to attaining success, right? Who maintain a certain kind of social responsibility to the community that birthed them, right, or even to the politics that their music creates. They, in a certain kind of way, are putting into practice an ideology otherwise referred to within hip hop culture as keeping it real, right? While your other artist, who is certainly relying on mainstream visibility in order to develop some modicum of success, is keeping it profitable. And within hip hop culture, there has been this debate, this even divide, right, that we see kind of coming to a head, especially as it pertains to the battle between Kendrick Lamar and Drake versus, over what's the best route for these rappers to actually take to achieve success? Is it by keeping it profitable or keeping it real? Right? This has almost kind of created a little bit of a schism, right? This tension between keeping it real and keeping it profitable has created a bit of a kind of schism within the psyche of not only the hip hop cultural context, right? Or the hip hop cultural framework, um, but even it actually kind of highlights and kind of magnifies to a certain degree the kind of schizophrenia or the kind of schism that exists within the larger American cultural landscape between keeping it real versus keeping it profitable. And we see this being played out. Hip hop is very conscious of this schism, right? The schism within the national consciousness, even within its own hip hop cultural context, consciousness. It's very conscious of this schism, right? And so we see this consciousness, right? This self awareness in art pieces like this here, right? Which is actually derived from. This is actually by an art piece that's done by Roberto Parada, right? And this comes out of an article from a Vibe magazine in 2008 on T.I., right? When he came out with his album entitled T.I. versus T.I.P., right? Or even 50 Cent's Get Rich or Die Trying, or Cassidy's Split Personality, right? Which is another album that these are album titles, right? Or even Nelly's Sweat versus Suit, where on the one hand, you have the demonstration of a personality type that is all about keeping it profitable. Here we actually see just visually illustrated towards us, right? The overcoat, right? The suave, sophisticated, debonair look that a rapper by the name of Ti kind of keeps that he shows to the public, right? That stays on the outside, right? It's the external sheath, right? Which covers the internal, right? Always ready to actually do or exert violence. This here was at the time. TIP is certainly reformed as an individual, as a man, as a person, as a human being, from this time frame. This is certainly from a different time frame. Now, T.I., I would certainly say, is neither one of these images here, right? But rather he has certainly evolved into a third space, right? A more well-developed, um, um, more mature version of than either of these two visions of himself here, right? But here, right, what we get to see is in this old personality, or rather this old way, right? He's keeping it real. Why? How? Because of his ability to wage violence, right? His ability to, right, take it back to the streets if he needs to, which is precisely what this image here actually suggests. Do not get fooled by the allure of the outside, right, and the exterior of my calm demeanor. I can take it back to the streets if necessary, right? You see no clearer demonstration of this battle within the culture's consciousness, right? Between keeping it real versus keeping it profitable than this image right here by Roberto Parada. You see, and part of the reason why, what's responsible for the construction of this schism, right, like I mentioned earlier, right, kind of lies back into the hearts of the conflict that exists at the soul of the nation, right, at the root of the soul of the nation, where on the global marketplace, right, Blackness only is valued in the ways in which it was valued during the times and the periods of the antebellum enslavement, as objects, not people, but property to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. Rap, as a musical industry, is valuable based on its ability to market successfully a piece of who these artists are, not them in the fullness of their humanity, but rather only a fragment. Just as we saw in the ad earlier, right? With those metonymic signifiers, those elements of Blackness, those fragments of Blackness, right? And success is determined based on the globe's global appetite for consuming this fragmentary Blackness, right? So the consumption of this fragmentary Blackness is illustrated by what I'm calling industrialized rap, right? Which is also too what we could refer to as mainstream rap, at once renders such a particular kind of blackness, right? The blackness that's bought and sold on the global marketplace, right? To the highest bidder, only in pieces, never as the full humanity, but rather only ever as three-fifths of a human being. It renders it flat and one dimensional, right? You see, this is an instance in which it doesn't even matter whether or not you recognize yourself as being fully human. The world in which your image is being used and recirculated and marketed and advertised sees only a part of you. And insofar as they see that part of you, they see it as representative of the whole. They think about it as being the sum total of who you are, right? And therefore, the sum total of the culture that you represent, right? You see, industrialized rap is an example, a specific kind of example of the enactment of the ideology of cream in a hip hop sense. Cream in a hip hop sense can be defined as taking drawing on the 1993 debut song right from the Wu-Tang Clan. Cash rules everything around me, right? It refers to the ideology or the belief that cash is the ultimate ruling and determining factor that distinguishes that which is alive from that which is not worth living, right? And in this sense, industrialized rap or mainstream rap, the rap with the cultural machine behind it, right? The cultural machine of advertising, which takes and breaks down an individual right into smaller component pieces to be bought and sold around the global marketplace, is indeed a culture through which identities, beliefs, and practices of what scholars would call prodigal lifestyle, right? The prodigal lifestyle, right? Or prodigal living is expressed, right? Prodigal lifestyle being just quite simply a lifestyle where they're spending extravagantly and making it rain, right? A lifestyle where, you only have one life to live. So YOLO, reckless living, actually sits in the driver's seat, right? A lifestyle in which self-absorbed narcissism outweighs any commitment or any kind of inkling of awareness to a need for maintaining social responsibility for the politics that your music actually participates in or even creates, let alone for sustaining, nourishing, and cultivating the communities that birthed said rapper. Here, just to kind of reinforce the idea, well, I'll come back to that a little bit later on, right? So how do we see this idea, this concept of cream, right? Where does this come from? Well, it comes directly from the 1993 debut song from the Wu-Tang Clan entitled Cream, which stands for Cash Rules Everything Around Me, in which the first rapper on that song goes by the name of Raekwon the Chef. He says, right, he recounts thinking about his own life. I grew up on the crime side, the New York Times side. Now, let's stop right here just for a quick second, right? When he says, I grew up on the crime side, the New York Times side, what he's referring to here is quite simply back in the 1970s, back in during the era just after the civil rights movement, right? Where you had where we saw civil rights legislation, right, desegregate not only schools, but also lived communities, right? Whereas racial restricted housing covenants, right, were no longer deemed acceptable, right? Were no longer deemed or protected by the law, right? Saw the integration of these communities with Black folks, with brown folks, with Jewish folks, so on and so forth, right? People who were typically kept out of those neighborhoods, right? And they were actually excluded or made it so that way they could never actually be invited to those neighborhoods, right? Which is actually kind of covered in this book by Richard Rothstein. It's called The Color of Law. I'm not sure if you all can actually kind of see this, or I kind of put this up, right? This book right here by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law actually details the history of the practices of redlining and also racially restrictive housing covenants that kept people of color, especially always black folks. Sometimes that meant Jewish folks. Sometimes that meant brown folks. Sometimes that meant Chinese. Sometimes that meant Japanese. Sometimes that meant Korean. Sometimes it might have meant Mexican. Sometimes it might have meant Puerto Rican, right? But it always meant black folks, right? To keep them out of those neighborhoods, right? After the passage of the 1960 Civil Rights Act, we saw the dissolution of those racially restricted housing covenants. And subsequently, we saw the integration of those areas and neighborhoods and schools and workplaces and so on and so forth. We saw the integration of those spaces, which created racial conflict and was soon followed by what's known as white flight, right? And so, as a result of these racial conflicts, what you also saw was heightened news media coverage on areas that were predominantly populated by black folks all across the United States, where news media would examine or ask a question: how is life proceeding for black folks after the passage of these civil rights era? I mean, excuse me, of these civil rights legislation. Oftentimes, these news broadcasts would just quite simply highlight crime in the ghetto, right? And they started even beginning to use the word ghetto, right, to describe in popular news media areas where black folks who were largely, which were largely marked by poverty, particularly because of the, at the time, then growing lack of access to gainful employment, right? Because of, or as a result of deindustrialization of the 1970s, right? And the 1980s. What replaced those jobs were, in a sense, drug usage, which was fueled by the lack of ability for individuals, particularly men, to get a job, right? And there's a bunch of literature that I think you all could certainly find, not just through Google searches, but even in other classes that some of you may take, especially in sociology or even in Africana studies or even in Chicano studies, where they kind of dive a lot more deeply into some of the socioeconomic um, um, context. Um, Even in, I think I said sociology as well, that led up to deindustrialization, right? So I would, or even history. I'm sorry, that was the other course that I meant to actually discuss, right? So I would certainly, if you have taken those classes, I would definitely go back and take a look at some of the literature that you might have actually come across, where it was talking about what some of the socioeconomic factors were that led up to deindustrialization, and that led to an uptick in crime, particularly an uptick in drug use, right? Michelle Alexander has a book called The New Jim Crow, in which she recounts the socioeconomic context in that led to deindustrialization and that led to an uptick in drug usage, along with a flooding of drugs in these major black or predominantly populated black areas, black urban enclave areas, which also saw an uptick or an increase in the use of excessive force by policing, right? Or through policing, right? Over policing is what we see an uptick in, right? So when the RZA, excuse me, when Raekwon the chef says, "I grew up on the crime side, the New York Times side," what he's alluding to here is, right, the mainstream popular portrayal of his neighborhood where he grew up, right, which was in Brooklyn, Flatbush, Brooklyn, I believe is where he's from, um, as a place that's filled with crime, drug riddled violence, right? And we know this is where he's coming from, right? We know that this is what he's alluding to by the second line, right? Staying alive was no jive, right? So highlighting that he comes from a place that's dangerous. He comes from a place that's filled with violence. He comes from a place, right, where it's survival of the fittest, right, which is to some degree or another kind of portraying, right, creating a kind of impression, right, an illusion of in which Darwin's in of an urban jungle, right, that's kind of survived by Darwinian rules, right, survival of the fittest, right, a young youth rocking a gold tooth, low goose, which refers to a haircut, right? Only way I begin to G off, right? Meaning the only way that I begin to actually raise my level of recognition, right? Raise my social status to where people become aware of who I am, and who become people who become aware of who I am, right? That is to say, the only way that I actually become visible, right? The only way that I become worth looking at, right? That is to say that before what happens at the end of this rhyme occurred, for your average everyday person growing up in the neighborhood that he grew up in, they were quite simply rendered invisible. They were made to be ignored, particularly through the mainstream portrayal of their neighborhoods as being nothing more than drug riddled, crime infested, hyper violent places of survival. So what it means to grow up in a space, right? That's this urban enclave, right? This urban jungle enclave where, staying alive was no jive, right? The only value that an individual has is just quite simply bare life, that they're just barely alive, right? But they're not even worth looking at. So for Raekwon, he actually puts together within a very short lifespan of these rhymes right here. The only way I begin to become visible, the only way I become valuable, the only way that I become see as being worthy of anything, right? The only way I begin to G off is drug loot, right? If we were in a live class, I would actually play the song and we would kind of dive more into it. But please feel free to take a look at the song. It's entitled Cream, right up here, right at your leisure, right? What the song ultimately goes through to reveal is what Raekwon and along with Inspector Deck carefully analyze as a result of critical observations of their neighborhood, right? The people who they're actually surrounded by within that neighborhood, and also too through the critical conversations that they have with some of their elders within their community. What they recognize is that they're trapped within a box, right? A major urban enclave, right? Or what was oftentimes kind of referred to, right, as the urban jungle, right? Very racist in terms of its representation, or rather its connotation, right? For as the living space for wild animals, right? Raekwon and Inspector Deck in the song entitled Cream share with us these critical observations that they make. And they recognize that within this space, right, as long as they're as long as they're relegated to this space, as long as they are made to stay in that space, right, their lives have no value. And so therefore the things that have value are things that exist outside of this space. And therefore, that is where they want to try to get to, outside of the gate, outside of the box. You see, what Raekwon and Inspector Deck actually observe here are the effects of deindustrialization and the effects of outsourcing jobs and a labor force. The effects, in other words, of what happens when the federal government, through a series of policies, deregulate the rules that were once set in place to ensure that Americans had access to employment, housing, healthcare, and education, to say the least, as well as equal protection under the law, so on and so forth. What Raekwon and Inspector Deck end up actually discovering is what happens when you don't have enough money to even be seen as worth keeping the regulation in place. When you just quite simply are a number on a sheet that composes a cost that can be thrown away, right? When you compose, or excuse me, when you are a number on a sheet that's calculated or tabulated as collateral damage. You see, what they're looking at, what they're observing in this song entitled Cream, are the effects of neoliberalism, which is a mode of governance that's based on free market values, right? Let the market decide, let the market determine, right, who gets access to what resources. Whoever can actually sell the best, who can sell themselves the best, who can make the best case, who can afford it. Whoever survives the rough and tumble of everyday life, right? Whoever demonstrates their worth through competitiveness should be the ones to live, should be the ones who get access to the resources that you need to live. You see, neoliberalism is characterized by at least 5 different components, different values, right? So these values that actually circumscribe neoliberalism are easily understood. Right? We've heard these things since the time before we were even born, right? Things like competitiveness, right? Individualism, right? Or self-interests, self-interestedness, right? Heck, I am an individual. I am different from everybody else, right? 2 Chainz even has a song called "I'm Different." Yeah, I'm different. I'm different. Yeah, I'm different. Pull up to the club with my Syllomism. Well, if we're gonna kind of sort of take 2 Chainz at face value based on what it is that he's articulating in his song that makes him different. It sounds like it's a convertible. So everybody else is pulling up to the club in a hardtop and he has a convertible, right? That kind of individualism, right? It's the one that separates themselves out from the larger community, the one that separates themselves from everyone else, right? We've been raised to think and to believe that that is precisely how one achieves success, right? By standing out from the crowd, right? And by doing whatever it takes in order to make it, right? We're hearing in a lot of ways right now, if anybody's actually been listening or watching to the news, right? Fed rate cuts, right? The market is bouncing back, right? The collusion between big tech industries, particularly Elon Musk, right? Tesla, and the federal government, right? Which push for, lobby for policies to get cut. Remember Elon with the big chainsaw? We're going to cut government in half. What he's talking about is deregulating the government, the federal government, which provides the rules and enforces the rules that prevent, that at least at one point in time, prevented people from being made poor, rather that prevented some people from being made to suffer, even in the condition of being poor, right? Rules that actually prevented things like what's happening right now, or what could possibly happen the day after tomorrow. So, excuse me, sorry. Yeah, yeah, the day after tomorrow, right? With SNAP benefits getting cut, right? Deregulation, right? And the liberalization, the opening up of borders, right? The free trade agreements, right? And the privatization, right? The private ownership of public resources, right? Whether it be land, air, water, or even houses, right? Or spaces. These are all the five characteristics of neoliberalism, right? And so, if one thinks about it, right, or if one is careful to observe, right, the question may actually arise of how did this even happen? How did we get to a point where people might actually lose their SNAP benefits? People might lose their access to general relief. People might lose their access to food stamps. How do we get to a place where now, in order for me to get an apartment, I need to make sure that I have a top tier credit score? Now, in order for me to get a job, I need to make sure that I have a top tier credit score, or I need to make sure that I brand myself. How do we get to a point where we begin thinking about ourselves instead of as a collective or a community or a group of individuals? How do we begin to think of ourselves as brands rather than people? Well, part of the ways in which that happened is through the legitimization of ideologies of individualism, right? The idea, the fantasies, right? The stories and the narratives that have been put forth by celebrities and top entertainers who've legitimized and who also, they themselves, in and of themselves, represent the idealized images of a consumerist, right? Meaning that it's a consumer base, right? Meaning that the idea is for, right, their audience to buy their products, buy their albums, buy their perfume, buy their concert tickets, buy in a free market world. You see, when consumers buy stuff and things, advertisers don't even sell objects anymore. They don't even sell products, rather. They haven't sold products since the 1950s, right? What they're into selling are ideas and lifestyles, right? And they attach those lifestyles to celebrities, top entertainers, who therefore sell you the image of the ideal lifestyle as they live it, which creates an environment in which their audience, their fans, see it and they say, I want to be just like them. In other words, celebrities and top entertainers end up reinforcing and creating a market friendly agenda, in which case, neoliberalism or cream, right? We can think of those two as being inextricably linked, right? Rappers have already figured out a very smart way to understand and to explain neoliberalism, not in such a highfalutin academic kind of way, right? Like I was explaining, but rather as cash rules everything around me. You see, cream or neoliberalism represents a new secular faith, right? It represents a new kind of belief, right? It kind of requires a belief that promotes the idea of profit or capital as the ultimate ruling device, right? So there, that is to say, right? Those folks who have the most money have the biggest influence, and have the biggest voices in the federal government that governs how it is that we live our lives, right? And that governs and shapes how a public gains access to resources that they need to live. All the while, that public is filled with conspicuous consumers. So that is indeed it for today, folks. That is our lecture on hip hop, cream, and neoliberalism. I'll stop sharing right now. Any questions, comments, concerns, emotionally justifiable outbursts, something that I said that doesn't really make sense that you want me to go back and revisit? I'm here for questions. Now is Q&A, questions and answer time, folks. How are y'all? Are y'all with me? Did any of that make sense? Give me a thumbs up in the chat if you all are following along with me, if it made sense. If you're able to actually see the connections between the books and things like that. Hey, Isel. Okay, cool. Great. Excellent. Nice. Okay. Jojo. What's up? Okay, cool. Great. Excellent. Thank you. Excellent. Good. Okay, cool. All right, folks. Well, that's all for today then. If there are no questions, then I'll go ahead on and I'll wrap us up and take us home a little bit early. But before I actually do, let me actually direct your attention. Sorry, I do need to share my screen one more time. Back to Jennifer Government, right? And the document entitled Themes of Jennifer Government. So all those things that I just mentioned right down here are all explained here in this sheet. Right now on this sheet. Now you're going to find these same themes in Jennifer Government. Here's the phrase that pays. This is what's going to help you throughout your entire time while you're reading Jennifer Government. And a lot of you should actually be somewhere like between like pages 80 and 158. You want to look for these themes. What scenes do you see these themes here at work? That means that you got to study this sheet. I know. Here goes that professor again, making us do all this homework, making us study and stuff, man, making us memorize definitions and stuff like that. I know. Yes, folks, that is me. That is my job. I'm supposed to do those things. Okay. So make sure that you study the themes of Jennifer Government. And when you study these themes here, I want you to look for them specifically in the book. Highlight some key scenes where you may actually see an example of spectacle, where you may actually see an example of wage slavery, where you may actually see an example of a dominant corporation, right? This should not be that hard to actually identify, right? Or highlight characters who might be associated with these themes, right? The theme of a dominant corporation, right? I can think of several characters who are actually connected with them, right? The theme of neoliberalism / cream, right? Or the theme of conspicuous consumption, right? The idea where, which is a behavior whereby an individual can display wealth through extensive leisurely activities, right? Or by buying the most popular, the flyest, the newest, the latest, the most exclusive kicks or shoes or device, right? I want you all to actually look for these themes here in the book entitled Jennifer Government, right? That's not all that I want you to do, okay? So look here, watch this, right? I also want y'all to take a look at the next theme that we have. This is another document that's in themes, symbols, and motifs, right? So here, right here, we see themes defined, right? The definition of themes, right? This is just a list of everything, right? Definition of motifs. Right? This is a list of what those things are as they pop up in the novel, right? So you want to pay close attention to all these things that are popping up here in the novel, right? Symbols, here's the definition of it, right? These are all things that are attached, these are themes, motifs, and symbols that pop up in the novel by Max Barry and that you want to actually read for. Now, when you're reading for them, and you're taking notes, right? It's not just that you want to just identify them, but no, 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 no. You want to actually see, okay, what symbols are connected with which of these motifs, right? And which motif or symbol is attached to which characters, right? And what kind of mission is that character on? Does that character's mission or journey in the novel help us to understand how the dominant corporation works? Does that character's mission explore the limitations of cream or neoliberalism? Does that character's mission in the novel take us through what it's like to live through wage slavery? Right? So you want to think about the connections, right? The fundamental connection between symbols and motifs, right? Which of these symbols or motifs are attached to which characters, right? These symbols and motifs are always going to be tied to either one character or multiple characters. For example, right here, let's use just for, I'm just going to take the first one, right? Nike Mercury's, right? That symbol right there. It's a symbol of which one of these themes here, right? Well, at the very least, right, it's certainly a symbol of neoliberalism, right? Because the Nike Mercuries were seen as a marketing tool that corporate leaders wanted to actually use as a way to drive up revenue for their new product, right? Nike Mercury's, the idea behind it, right, was to use a guerrilla marketing campaign, right? The idea for how they were going to actually increase revenue was to use a guerrilla marketing campaign where kids who were trying to buy the shoes would get shot, killed at the mall when the shoes were just released as a marketing ploy, right? Now, what characters do we see attached to that scene where folks are buying Nike Mercuries and they get caught up in a guerrilla marketing campaign that's used to further or advance corporate greed? All right. Haley McDonald, absolutely, right? Haley McDonald, and also to John Nike, right, who represents, right, that figure of corporate greed, right, or even the dominant corporation. Excellent, excellent job, right? Um, in the dialectical journal, you want to actually identify key quotes and passages that demonstrate the use of these symbols and motifs as they're attached to those characters, right? So you want to find specifically where those scenes are in the novel and you want to highlight them, right? Because you're looking for quotes or passages from the book that represent or where one of these symbols or motifs or even themes, excuse me, can be found, right? Your analysis, right, your response on the right side of the dialectical journal should reveal the connections between the symbols, motifs, and characters, or how a character has certain symbols attached to them, maybe even certain motifs attached to them, right? And how they enact the larger theme, right? That's what your response should actually focus on, right? That's what your response should actually break down. Okay. That's a good question, Isel. Excellent. Right. And in fact, I want you all to actually look for, as you're reading in the book, I want you to look for quotes or passages that represent either themes, either the themes that are provided, right? The motifs that are provided, or the symbols, right? You can identify quotes and passages that represent any one of these. Sometimes you'll have quotes and passages that might represent all three of these things, right? It might have, like I said, right? It's like Nike Mercury, guerrilla marketing, right? And corporate greed, right? All within a very short passage, right? You don't want long passages because your response needs to double the length of the actual quote that you're selecting itself. Okay. But that's what you want to read for. All right. Next week, when we come on here for our YouTube live, we'll go through some examples in preparation for our dialectical journal assignment. We'll go through some examples of key passages from throughout the text that I'll highlight, right? And that I'll also to use to exemplify quotes that I would select for the dialectical journal. Okay. That doesn't mean that you got to wait until then, because that's not going to come until Thursday. These assignments are due Sunday. You don't want to wait that long. You want to go ahead on and get started on it now. If you need help or if you want some further guidance or anything like that, please feel free to definitely select a time and a date that works for you to have an office hours meeting with me, right? And then we can discuss that more concretely there. Okay. All right, folks. Any other questions? Comments, concerns, emotionally justifiable outbursts? No, no live last week. No live last week. You didn't miss anything. No problem, Isla. No problem at all. Okay. So if there are no further questions, I will see you all next week. Great. Excellent. Cool. Right. I'll see you all next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. We'll do next Thursday, 6 o'clock, and we'll have our next YouTube live where we'll go over the book, Jennifer Government, and do some dialectical journal exercises. All right, folks. Y'all take care. Enjoy your evenings and have a happy Halloween. Be safe. Take care of yourselves and each other. Peace.